right, thank you, Chris, and again, thanks for everyone for attending today. It's great to see so many people here interested in this issue and moving forward, hopefully with some salt reduction. As the scientist, I feel like I'm always the person to deliver bad news, and I guess that's sort of what my role is today, is to remind us why we're here, why we're all interested in this topic. And I hope maybe in a few years we'll be getting together and I'll be giving you a presentation about some good news related to road salt. So just as a reminder to all of us, and I think especially those that are operators here, everyone's aware of this, but when we speak about road salt, in particular, we're talking about sodium chloride primarily as the primary de-icing salt that we use around here. But that's a general term, so there's other sorts of salts that we apply to our roads, calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, or combinations of those things. And we put it on our roads, hopefully not in this quantity, and I apologize, I think this is a section of state road, I apologize to the DOT folks for this, but it was just a photo that I couldn't stop and not take a picture of, but we put it on our roads to prevent the bond of snow and ice to the surface so that they can be plowed clean and so that we can get to work every day, we can bring our kids to school, we can get to the hospital, doctor's appointments, get our packages from Amazon, Amazon Prime, 2-day delivery, all that sort of wonderful stuff that we rely on our road network for. We haven't always used salt, though, to maintain our surfaces. This figure shows salt use in the United States specific for winter road de-icing practices. You can see that in 1940 we weren't using much salt at all, and it was really sort of from the 40s to the 70s that we discovered this as a practice that would improve the maintenance of our roads in the winter, and we sort of adopted it in this exponential fashion. And then from the 70s to the mid-90s, we sort of leveled off in our use nationally, around 10 million tons per year. But then in the mid-90s, I don't know if we rediscovered salt, as maybe we could use a lot more of it. And we had a pretty significant jump and almost doubling of its use across the nation. In the Adirondacks, it's a similar story. These are some data from the Adirondack Watershed Institute. They did an analysis of salt use in the park back in both 2012 and 2015 different studies. We use just shy of 200,000 tons of salt in the Adirondacks per year. A little bit more than half comes from state road application, a little bit less than half comes from local road application. Our local municipalities maintain about 3 times more road surface than the state, so that means that the state applies about 3 times more salt per lane mile than our local municipalities do. And that is large part due to the fact that state roads are higher speed roads, major arteries between communities, and also the state's practice is to primarily use salt versus an abrasive or a salt sand mix. I also like to remind folks to sort of think of those numbers from a different perspective. That's about 1.5 tons of salt per capita in the Adirondack. So as we sort of think about these numbers, imagine that if instead of putting it out on the road, your highway department or the state delivered your allotment to your end of your driveway every year for every person in your house. I think that would be, we really realize just how much salt we're using if we sort of thought of it in that way. The concern from the environmental side is that road network in the park runs off into 77% of the lake's surface area in the park, and that's excluding Great Sacandaga Lake, Lake George, and Lake Champlain, which are just huge and outliers and would push that number way higher, and 52% of the stream length. So that's the potential for salinization that exists within the park as a result of our application of salt to the road network. And we, in fact, do see that salinization. The Adirondack Watershed Institute now, I think it's 7 years ago, published a study showing the relationship between the density of state roads in particular in lakes' watersheds and the amount of both sodium and chloride that are in those lakes. I think it's 84% of the variation can be explained by state road application. But if we look at individual water bodies, we can see that also that this is a problem that's just getting worse over time. So we're at the Adirondack Champlain Regional Salt Summit, so I thought it would be prudent to include some data from Lake Champlain, which we don't hear about this issue as being a major issue in Lake Champlain very often, but there are 14 long-term monitoring sites in the lake itself, and this is data that was published in 2008. It's from 1992 through 2007, and I know you can't see the numbers here, but 9 out of the 14 stations show a significant increase in chloride concentrations over that period of time. 2 of them show a decline, although very small, and 3 of them show no change at all. When we get up into the basin, all 8 major tributaries on the New York side show significant increases in chloride concentration over this same period of time. And on the Vermont side, it's 5 out of the 10 show a significant increase. So even this very large water body, sometimes referred to as the 6th Great Lake, we can see the effect of the salt that's being applied in the basin. Lake George, they've really been leading on the implementation of best management practices and pushing forward salt reduction initiatives. And in Lake George, from 1980 to 2010, there was a 3-fold increase in the chloride concentrations in the lake, from about 5 milligrams per liter to about 15 milligrams per liter. In the Adirondack uplands, lakes that are not impacted by salt, the median concentration is 0.24 milligrams per liter. So that gives you sort of a perspective on where they're at compared to where the lake likely was before we started applying salt to the watershed. Mirror Lake, right out the doors, beautiful little water body right here in Lake Placid. Mirror Lake is probably the most impacted lake in the Adirondacks, maybe in New York State, and at the top of the list probably nationally as well, and I'll get into the science behind that a little bit later in the talk. But in Mirror Lake, we've seen a 10-fold increase in both sodium and chloride from 1976 to present. We're currently at 40 milligrams per liter of salt at the surface. That's 160 times higher than what we would expect to see in the lake. So it's pretty clear that we have regional salinization of our water bodies in the park as a result of the use of salt on our roads, and that many of the water bodies are showing increases in those concentrations over time. We also have groundwater salinization. This is another, sort of provocative photo that's meant to make us stop and think for a second that we are drinking the salt that we put on our roads, or at least some of us in the park are that are on a private well source. So I like to challenge people to think, imagine if a server at a restaurant came over and asked you if you'd like a salt with your glass of water. You'd probably say, no thank you, I don't want you to do that. We have 30 stream monitoring stations in our watershed, and one of the things that made us realize that we probably had widespread groundwater contamination is in the latter part of August through September, we see the highest persistent chloride concentrations in these streams, months after the salt was applied, and a time of year when our streams are at what we call base flow, and they're fed primarily by shallow groundwater. Every stream that is affected by road runoff shows this in our watershed, and the Watershed Institute has other streams elsewhere in the park that they saw this as well. And so that led the Watershed Institute to start looking at what was going on in groundwater from private wells across the park. And this has been supported by both the Fund for Lake George and 80K Action to have this study done. They've looked at, I think, 500 wells now, and they're grouped into 3 different categories: wells that receive no runoff from roads, wells that receive runoff from local roads, and wells that receive runoff from state roads. And what they found so far is that for sodium, the drinking water guidance value is 20 parts per million, and that's really meant to protect people that have maybe sort of kidney disorders or heart disease, any reason that their doctor may have them on a low sodium diet. 20% of the wells that are receiving runoff from local roads exceed that guidance value. And for state roads, it's 64% of the wells exceed this guidance value. Chloride, the threshold is higher. It's mostly an aesthetic threshold at 250 parts per million. And in that case, we have 3% of the wells receiving runoff from local roads exceeding that value, and 29% for the state roads. And none of the wells that are not receiving runoff exceed these values. So the ones that are not impacted are not above these values. So this is pretty clear that as we put more salt on our roads, we see more salt in our groundwater. It's the same relationship that we see with our surface water. And of course, this raises concerns about human health, property values, and a whole number of things. I put this slide up here not to totally scare everyone, but there's a story here with Flint, Michigan, related to road salt and drinking water supplies that I don't think a lot of people really realize. It's not talked about too often. But when they switched their water supply to the Flint River, that river had higher concentrations of sodium and chloride, as well as a lot of other things that we wouldn't really want to be drinking. And what the water operators didn't account for is that that water was going to be more corrosive to the water distribution system than the water that they were previously using, which the science is pretty clear will likely result in the leaching of heavy metals out of fixtures and pipes that exist within that system. Municipal sources, they can put additives into the water system that help coat that distribution system to limit that, which they did not do, which is why they had their crisis. But a private well owner is not going to be able to implement those sort of solutions to protect themselves, and they may not even know that they have elevated chloride concentrations in their water, or that they have fixtures that have heavy metals in them that might be leaching as a result of that. There was actually a study looking at that issue specifically in New York State, up in Orleans, New York, related to a salt storage facility. And they came out last year and they did show with bench testing the elevated leaching of heavy metals, lead, zinc, and copper out of out of fixtures as a result of elevated salt concentrations. And they then modeled what they found in that one study for the rest of New York. And this map shows by county the proportion of private well users potentially affected by road salt application. Across the state, it's 460,000 well users that might be impacted by just the general application of salt to our roads and the subsequent runoff that results as a result of that. And it's 24% of the private well population. And this actually lines up almost perfectly with what the Watershed Institute has found when you pool all of the wells that they're looking at and the proportion of them that are affected by this runoff. So it's clear that we have regional groundwater salinization, and there's definitely concerns associated with that. I want to end by just talking a little bit about Mirror Lake. Mirror Lake has the unfortunate distinction of being one of just a few lakes now in the country that have been documented in the scientific literature as having the turnover of the lake interrupted as a result of road salt runoff. And so what happens in Mirror Lake is, as the mayor mentioned, there's a bunch of stormwater pipes that when we apply salt to the parking lot, sidewalks, and roads around the lake, run off directly into the lake. And that stormwater frequently in the winter, the concentration of chloride is 2,500 milligrams per liter. That's 10,000 times higher than what we find in Adirondack streams. It's 10 times higher than the EPA's chronic toxicity threshold for aquatic life. It's 3 times higher the acute toxicity threshold for aquatic life. And as a result of all that additional salt, the water is more dense than the water in the lake. And we watch this in real time, so we're out there drilling holes through the ice all winter long. That salt just runs along the lake bottom, right to the bottom of the lake. And so all winter long, as we're monitoring, we see this happen with the road salt runoff. It just fills up the bottom of the lake. To the point where when we get to the end of the winter, the surface is about 40 milligrams per liter. The bottom is like 120 or 130 milligrams per liter. And it's about the bottom half of the lake. So when it comes to springtime, our lakes should turn over and mix. This is a really fundamental and critically important process for the health of a lake like Mirror Lake. It drives much of the chemistry and biology of the lake. Mirror Lake only mixes in the top half. And the reason is we have these 2 different layers in the lake of different densities. The analogy that I always like to make is it's like Italian salad dressing. When you pull it out of the fridge, you have oil and vinegar. You need to put a lot of energy into that bottle to mix it all up before you put it on your salad, or at least most people like to do that. And it's the same thing with the lake. We have to put more energy in to get it to mix. The lake just doesn't have that. The energy isn't available to do that, so the lake doesn't mix completely. And so the water at the bottom is trapped down there. It has low dissolved oxygen because bacteria are doing their thing down there and using it up. As we move into the summer, the lake surface warms. Mirror Lake is fortunate to have a lake trout population. It's also stocked with rainbow trout by DEC. And we end up with a situation where those fish are pinched into a really narrow band of water where it's too warm above, high salt and low oxygen below. And it's frequent that we have this go to a point where there's no preferable habitat left for those fish. It's not to the point where it kills them, but it's to the point where they would be under greater physiological stress as a result. But there's also a cascade of other things that occur that are a little bit more difficult to explain in 25 minutes, where we get leaching of phosphorus and heavy metals out of the sediments as a result of the long period of no oxygen at the bottom of the lake. This all means that the lake is more susceptible to things like algal blooms. Knock on wood, hasn't happened yet, but this is a concern that any water body in the Adirondacks should have at this point in time. We're seeing increased occurrence of harmful algal blooms across the state. Mirror Lake's resistance to that is reduced as a result of both the high salt concentrations and the lack of turnover. We've also done some modeling of the lake to show that if the fall turnover were to ever be interrupted, right now it is not, we would more than likely have a winter fish kill as a result. Because we're not replenishing the oxygen in the lake, it would reduce to the point where over the winter, as the lake's frozen, doesn't get a lot of additional oxygen input to it, we would see a die-off of probably a large number of the fish that are in the lake as a result of that. So the challenge with Mirror Lake, and where I think it's particularly relevant to the structure of today, is it's not just New York State DOT putting a lot of salt down around the lake. It's not just the town or the village. It is a whole lot of people. We did some analysis of the watershed 2 years ago. The blue line is the watershed. When you stand out on the beach there, you're looking up towards Cobble Hill and Mount Whitney. That's the headwaters of the Mirror Lake watershed. It's pretty small. The different colors here delineate different surface types within the watershed: parking lots, sidewalks, driveways, and roads. We added all those surfaces up and broke them down by who was maintaining them, at least in terms of the municipalities in the state. And the thing that came out of that is there's more parking lot draining into Mirror Lake than any road type. So if we just focused on the village and the town and the state, we would be missing likely a huge portion of the salt that's entering this water body. So in these urban environments, we need to not just look at the municipal applicators. We need to be looking at what the hotels and the businesses are doing as well. And you know, another thing that stands out is there's more driveway in the Mirror Lake watershed than there is town road or state road or village sidewalk. And there's probably a wide range of things being done on those driveways, but it's another component that we need to be looking at if we really want to solve this problem. So in summary, we have salinization of both our surface water and our groundwater in the Adirondacks. The science of this is really clear, and it's not just in the Adirondacks. There's research showing both surface and groundwater salinization across North America, across New York State, even Europe. There are ecological impacts as a result of this salinization. The science on this is really clear too. There are just papers upon papers upon papers coming out telling us why we should be concerned about this and what the ecological impacts are. There's potential concerns for human health, and this is, not specific to the Adirondacks. There's been research done on this across New York State, across the country. It's a problem that many places are dealing with, from the private well, supplies right up to municipal water supplies, like Flint, Michigan, that are dealing with, potentially rising salt levels in their municipal water supplies. And so if we want to protect the environment and our groundwater resources, we really need to find ways to reduce the amount of salt that we're using. And that's hopefully why we're all here today. So I just want to end by thanking our funders and partners. We do all of our science work in partnership with the Adirondack Watershed Institute. I also want to thank the Village of Lake Placid and the town of North Elba. As the mayor said, they have been supporters and engaged participants in this issue here in Mirror Lake for the last 5 years. And they're going to be working with us over the next couple of years to implement some of the best management practices that you're going to be hearing about today and that the folks down in Lake George have been spearheading. Also the Mirror Lake Watershed Association and our various funders, the Holderreed family and the Golden Arrow, that we're here today. They're big supporters of the work that we're doing. We really appreciate that, as well as the Mirror Lake Inn Charitable Fund and the Cloud Splitter Foundation, New York State, all these other folks. So that is it. I don't know if we're going to be taking questions, Chris, but
we could take
sure.
A couple questions if there weren't.
Brendan, two quick questions. Is there a simple test that a private well owner can check the water coming out of his tap to see how much sodium or chloride is coming out of his private well?
There are, but I wouldn't really rely on them.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, so the question was if there's a simple test for a private well owner to test the amount of salt that's in their water, basically. There are, if you go online, you can find various tests where you basically take a water sample, add a little tab, shake it up, the water turns like a blackish color. The blacker it is, the more salt is in there. But those are not very precise. And so if you're interested in having your water tested, I would get in touch with Dan Kelting at the Watershed Institute. The last I was aware, and if anyone knows differently, you can correct me if I'm wrong, they were still accepting samples to be tested, and that is free. And there is a bit of a longer turnaround time on that. And there's also private labs, Endyne in Plattsburgh. You could bring your water sample there, and they would turn around a little bit faster, but you're going to have to pay for that.
All right, one other question. Around the lakes, in the Adirondacks and other places, a lot of homes have water softeners. Has science ever looked at what water softeners do in terms of softening the water and the water going back into the ground? Does that have any effect on what you just talked about, or is the effect minimal?
I'm sure there is an effect of that. In terms of the impact on the groundwater, I don't know that that's been specifically studied. But when we look at the regional scale, park-wide, and the way that the study was designed, looking at runoff from local roads and state roads, that would be an additional amount of variation in there, but it wouldn't override the signal that we're seeing. When they were doing the well testing, though, for private wells, they do ask the question of whether or not you have a water softener, and they ask you to sample before the softener, so right at the wellhead. So there might be some influence at that individual location if they're on a septic system with that going back into the well, but I don't think it would override the regional signal that we're seeing.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brett. Thank you very much.